Okay, welcome everyone to the Melbourne School of Design, and welcome to tonight's lecture, Transformative Tectonics by Holger Kehne of Plasma Studio. My name is Alan Peart, I'm Director of the Melbourne School of Design here at the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. I'd like to begin proceedings tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land in which this event is taking place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and pay respect to their families and elders, both past and present. Now, it's incredible that out with semester we've got an audience like this. We were scheduled to be in one of the small lecture rooms and we've had to upgrade, so that's testament to Plasma Studio's work. And I also want to just formally welcome the AE Visiting School, particularly to the staff. They've all come over to teach into the studio, but specifically as well to Paul Lowe from the faculty, who's been working tirelessly to bring the studio over to Melbourne. It's a great opportunity for our students and students from around Australia to participate, and really over the next few years hopefully we can continue that relationship. So welcome to all the students and good luck with the studio. I also had to acknowledge that it's one of 3 other intensive studios that are going on throughout the faculty, and we've also got visitors from ITB and Bandung. So hopefully some of them are in the audience who are getting reviewed in the morning, so they're getting a crit in the morning. So a big welcome to all our guests from near and far who are with us this week in Melbourne. Now in tonight's lecture, Holger will draw on a wide range of projects from Plasma Studio with diverse processes and techniques to discuss the tectonics of transformation, conductivity and complexity. Growing up in the UK and having a practice in the UK, I've watched Plasma Studio fondly and how they've evolved, and it's a great opportunity for me as well as all our students to see how you develop a practice over a period of time. And it's incredible to see the amount of awards that Plasma Studio have gained throughout the years. Right back to 2002 when they won Young Architect of the Year, BD and Chorus, the Hot Dip Galvanising Award in 2002, and then the Next Generation Architects Award 2007, and the Contract World Award in 2008. And then the Europe 40 Under 40 in 2009. An incredible portfolio of work and recognition for that work. They're also widely published, as well as numerous well-known architecture books. You'll find them in the Architectural Review, Icon, Mark, Wallpaper, New York Times, the Financial Times. So you can see they traverse a whole range of publications and outputs. So it's fantastic to welcome Holger here. And please join me in thanking Holger, but also the AE Visiting School. This is one of 5 public events this week, so please go on the website and register for the other events, and please stay around at the end. Donald Bates will be hosting a Q&A at the end, and we'll have a roaming mic. So please, give me a round of applause.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. It's my first time in Australia. That's why I thought, first of all, thanks really to Uni Melbourne for hosting me, Jeff and Paul for organizing all this, and my teaching colleagues, the students, and everybody that showed up here so numerously today. It's my first time in Australia, so I thought this is a good opportunity to show actually pack this up really and show pretty much a cross-section through our work from the very beginning to, well, not so recently. I kind of like not showing recent work at all. I'm rather focusing on which projects have been more formative, which projects have actually shaped the way that we work and our language and our approach. So without further ado, I start with a few kind of concepts that really drive what our architecture. So this is actually an image from 8½, the dream sequence at the very beginning of a Fellini movie from the 1960s, which really shows that, represents how we are all part of the kind of large system, yeah? We're like, even our own kind of internal circuitry is kind of driven by the kind of surroundings, the systems that you can see kind of like hinted at through the kind of all these cables and the vehicles on this road. Then we're talking about affect, how in this case Spinoza, Leibniz, they have really shifted from a Platonic order towards a new sensibility, kind of like affect and ephemera, which Bernini has then kind of captured in an amazing way, kind of formally in this kind of marble sculpture. So affect is the interface really between the inside and the outside, yeah, between what we have and between the past and present. So in a way, this is what architecture helps to invigorate and to reinforce, which is really the connection between the local, the global, between the past and the future. Yeah, so we're connecting time and scale and space kind of together in a kind of like formational event every single time that we experience. And architecture is really an integral part of that. So we need to kind of engage with it on that level. Then there's some more specific ways of thinking about form and architecture, not so much in terms of like a design, but in terms of like a formation, like a process actually, how the index or the legibility comes to the fore, be it geological, be it biological, but there's a kind of a reading possible about like the forces that have actually shaped our systems that surround us. So, you know, and then it's about object field. I find this incredible. Unfortunately, I won't make it that far this time. But what is IS rock? Is this an object or is it actually part of that landscape? It's a kind of an exceptional case, I would say. Like a diamond is an exceptional case of a rock, but it's still kind of intrinsically related to that original rock. So IS rock is still intrinsically related to that landscape. And that's what we're trying to do in architecture. We're trying to kind of culminate or condense the systems and structures around, but create a kind of exceptional situations from that. That brings me, yeah, ultimately, the ultimate goal is really kind of to expand outwards or forwards, or be it inwards or whatever, to kind of like go beyond the kind of immediate situation and make people sort of understand like what else is there, like the sublime, the entropic, the virtual, all these kind of methods and systems of the way we think and what that represents about ourselves and about the other. So this is a motive like taken after Remkula saying that we as architects, we cannot really control the waves, but we have to kind of go with the waves. I would say, let's go one step further, like this kite surfer, he has not only to control the waves, but he also hangs upon the wind. So he has to actually become this differential between two very different forces, and he has to kind of like propel himself forward by really kind of putting attention to the wind and to the waves at the same time. So, and that is what everything that we are all doing is constantly happening. So one example of that is the kind of like the non-scalarness or scale in general. So here you have blood vessels, there you have like a riverbed, and this is one of our projects that is more related to the riverbed, but in its kind of conceptual approach, it's actually based on both of these systems at the same time. So there's a kind of non-scalarness that the diagram will actually introduce into our work. And this is just one of those scales, which is the one-to-one scale, the body. This is how we started at the AA in the first year, back in 2003. We casted how somebody sits on a staircase. So a staircase is not there for sitting, it's been designed for walking. Besides this staircase, which is actually kind of corresponding to the seating arrangement. So it's very uncomfortable to walk. So there's actually a very clear functional relationship between, for the geometry of the stairs. Now, when you can still sit on it, and what is actually happening when you do that? What are actually the geometric kind of relationships and dissonances between the body and the stairs, the Cartesian space and the kind of organic shape of the body, and how you can actually kind of create an index of these kind of two different relationships, of these two systems, and how can you then expand from there and project maybe a new kind of making a staircase that expands from its functionalist determination towards incorporating other kind of means and other geometries. So this is just an overview about the different scales in which we work. So these are coat hangers. Then there's like a lamp system. Then it gets increasingly bigger. But you see there's a kind of a formal approach, a certain kind of sensibility that carries through all these scales. And I will introduce some of these projects tonight. Then we're talking about time. Just to give you an overview, really, we started in London in 1999. Then we opened an office in northern Italy with a new partner, introduced Ulla Hell, and then we went to Beijing, and now I'm actually the one that has opened the office in Hong Kong. This is our first project in London. So we were actually, this is in 1999 to 2000. So this was basically the site, and the owner of this space here, he just wanted protection from rain. Now just wanted a canopy. Now then we said, like, what you don't need a canopy, you need something else. So we did the opposite. We actually moved the facade inwards so that actually the protection was given more natural. And then we also kind of created a completely new image and a complete new way of relating inside and outside to each other. So it's really like giving some private space off to the public realm, yeah, and create also at the same time charging this space or this interface between inside and outside through this kind of folded geometry. At the same time, this system here of is not random. It's not just about that interface of inside and outside, but it's also a continuation of the interior layout, which is actually, as most spaces are, very orthogonal. And we mapped out that orthogonality by introducing very cheap kind of plywood boards. So we were mapping the kind of building system onto the way that the floor plan is organized, and then we brought that forward into this kind of facade that then kind of becomes, again, this kind of, what I said before, this exception from that system, but still intrinsically kind of related and linked up to it. So there's like a light well in here, and then this is also a glass floor. So in order to bring light into the basement, so this is a very small project, but it has a lot of issues that we could develop at this very first moment. And then the kind of reflectivity that this folded glass facade does, it really multiplies the exterior in multiple facets. So it's an acceleration of the exterior conditions. Meanwhile, at night, it's completely transparent. So it changes a lot. And from there onwards, from this point onwards, we have always tended towards using reflective materials, transparent materials, translucent materials to really deal with the kind of ephemeral conditions and to give the architecture its own reign, let's say. So it's not so much about some willful form, but it's about kind of animating and articulating certain relationships and making this kind of like into events and into changeable conditions. And this is this kind of glass floor in here. Next project, 2001. This is an interior fit out for kind of a loft space, double height space. It was very bare, very simple for a silversmith. So so what he wanted all these kind of domestic functions and at the same time a working space. And they were a bit contradictory because he needed a lot of daylight for his, and there was a nice roof light in the ceiling. So we actually carved out, we produced this kind of spiraling series of platforms around the central void, let's say. And at the same time, we employed this grating, this metal grating, and then those two systems fused completely, and the whole structure was done from a kind of a metal structural frame, or space frame, let's say, that was self-supportive, and introducing some different kind of spatial conditions at the same time by articulating this kind of spiraling movement upwards, which was also part of his kind of like Tai Chi kind of teaching and spiritual sphere. Another, very briefly, just because this is a very simple kind of project that introduced the kind of parametric logic, but without actually using those tools. We were mapping the kind of existing edges of this loft space in London, and we introduced these vectors here that were all kind of like translating or connecting between certain kind of features of the space, and then that actually organized a new field condition, an interior field of elements. So, and then these were also then mapped by certain sliding doors, so that the space between office and private space could actually be alternatingly open or more enclosed when a client was coming. So this work-live condition, we kind of translated that into this kind of changeable pattern of different elements. So, and also this element, for instance, in here on this side, it's actually becoming a screen for these are video producers, and on the other side, it was their kind of domestic display and of other functions. So it's also this interface or separation between the domestic sphere and the office, and how the geometry is kind of articulating or a little bit drifting away from that very kind of rigorous layout and kind of becoming more playful when it comes to the furnishing itself. This is an installation that we've done in Mexico, like extremely cheap. So this is the kind of site condition, which was this open gallery. So this was for a polysensory festival. So we were thinking of first of all, we were mapping the existing site conditions as a series of arches and vaults, and then responded to that with a concept of interweaving between inside and outside. So this became a kind of a three-dimensional, a re-articulation of that boundary, let's say. And we made that from an extremely cheap series of wooden kind of elements, and just with the kind of cloth from the marketplace that was pink, because it was very common in Mexico to use these kind of colors. And it gave this kind of like local articulation, really, the kind of ephemeral conditions of that light quality in relation to that old kind of, almost medieval kind of structure, I would say. And yeah, it's really like an alternative to this very deterministic fences that were to be found in there. And at the same time, kind of how the space was then becoming used for the festival. I think this is another. Installations are very good, I think, for young architects to get certain ideas across, to one can be very experimental, and one sees it very kind of quickly built. Architecture, unfortunately, it takes years to be developed and to be. So for this installation, we were sponsored by British Steel or Chorus, and we were given these really very flimsy facade panels, which were like 2x4. So this is actually the kind of scalar relationship to the human body. And then we started to kind of like to articulate in model form, so in small scale, to kind of like how can we actually structurally develop something from those from those sheets which are actually structurally normally not very performative. And these kind of experiments became then translated into techniques, really, how to kind of fold. So these kind of triangular patterns that we have introduced into these panels, and how that kind of knowledge or the kind of physical contact or the physical translation of that by the designer or by our staff into certain forms that were then kind of able to carry certain loads or be standing right up. That was a really interesting experimental kind of like material translation, really. So a material that wasn't able to stand up was then becoming actually reinforced by the fact that we were carving holes in it. So that was an interesting kind of experiment. And how these elements were then kind of relating to, leaning onto certain kind of existing structures, and at the same time structuring the space and organizing it for other kind of elements to be introduced into the space. And then there were certain aspects like this kind of the light from the ceiling lights and so on, piercing through these holes. That was completely unforeseen. So architecture always has this extra dimension, this extra quality to it that makes it kind of exciting for me. It's not, you can never control everything, and that's definitely a good thing. So this was a huge surplus, really, to the project. And yeah. And then we projected and we kind of discussed a little bit through that also the extension of what's virtual, what's real, and by how the folded geometry can actually deform certain kind of graphical patterns as well. This was then a very important project for us that came through winning a kind of small competition, Hotel Puerto America in Spain. So this was one of these famous design hotels. I should go this way, I think, because of the camera. So John Novell, Arata Izozaki, Catherine Finlay, Ron Arrett, you name it, David Chipperfield, Foster Zaha, and we were kind of given floor plan 4. So how do you actually engage with that kind of, like, if you have that range of colleagues there and they're all kind of making their mark? So we really wanted to kind of use that opportunity, and this was definitely one of those. So we started on actually identifying that this kind of extrusion of the central corridor that you see in here, and then you have like this series of rooms kind of aligned in a very regular way alongside it. And so we identified certain kind of rhythms, and then we translated those into that these shear walls would actually interfere, or they would transform that corridor and deform it. So to create kind of local specificity from the overall global system in order to kind of like make each space kind of identifiable. Yeah, so it is about, we brought in deformation, as you can sort of see in here, right? And then, but we didn't kind of challenge the overall system because that was already been partially built, and it's also services going up and down, etc. So there's only so much that you can do really in this condition. And then this was really like, this is how we won the competition actually, with the kind of, I can still not believe that was the case. But it's about reflective materials, it's about a color gradient, yeah? So we wanted to give, besides the kind of deformation, also give an identifiable color to every single bit of the corridor. And that kind of like was actually eventually inverted. We then kind of just introduced the color through a small seam, and everything else was becoming metal. And this is the kind of like process that we underwent to kind of deal with the geometry. And we introduced these kind of gaps in here in the geometry in order to have the doors really vertical, so that everything else was not being constrained back by the doors. Yeah, here you can sort of see the approach. We have these LED light seams, yeah, that will gradually kind of change color. And then that color will respond to each of the rooms that is just aligned with it to the side, so that each room can actually be found by the very color that the walls of the room have, and that you will also have on your key card. So this is sort of how it looks like. Very difficult to photograph. Those color tints are very subtle. And then it's where this was given actually, where these two corridors come together. We wanted to develop something of a kind of a vortex. So how do you have these kind of two sequential kind of systems then kind of collide and again create this kind of exceptional condition or something very plastic? And we employed a series of frames actually to kind of translate that geometry and to eventually build it on site. And this was actually just a mock-up, and this is how it then was eventually looking. You can see that there's this kind of strange element here that is actually the ceiling dropping down and fusing with the floor. That's actually the first thing that you see when you come out of the lift core, and it's sort of in your way, in a very strange and uncomfortable way. And that was a little bit creating a level of catharsis, rather than offering people like an interface to see, this is Plasma Studio, okay, I can keep going, see the next floor, see Chipperfield or Zaha. No, we wanted them to kind of like, what is this? And then they had to actually go around it to understand and discover the space properly. Yeah, you can sort of see the lift and then this kind of like strange arrangement and proximities. And yeah, the space was becoming really like some sort of strange cave type organization or experience. And from there, from this series of, which at the same time it's kind of systematic, yeah? You see that there's always these kind of like groups of 4 doors that then have the shear walls in here and the bathrooms kind of organized together. And so we also kind of brought the floor level down and up again. So there's a kind of a rhythm actually that happens, yeah. And that rhythm for me was very important, that it's translating the former kind of reading of the kind of repetition, which was actually a bit monotonous. So you could still read it, but you would now kind of like read it with your body, it's almost like a dance, right? So you walk through the corridor and you feel actually it's going up and down and up and down. That actually means something. I guess not many people will actually kind of really understand that, but that's maybe more like for us as architects, like something that keeps us going. And then you have the rooms actually. Oh, let me just go. So here you have the rooms as this kind of like expanding from that kind of corridor organization, so you get this kind of crossing of this kind of area, which are the individual rooms with the longitudinal extrusion of that corridor. And the rooms, they're really the differential between the exterior, yeah, the natural light, the outside space, Madrid on the skyline, and this very artificially lit and completely disconnected corridor. So here you can sort of see in the cross section, yeah, like here you have the totally artificial, disconnected, very virtual kind of space, and then here you get actually information about the natural world, about the time of the day, etc. And the rooms are basically identifying these relationships by mapping certain kind of geometric coincidences. So you can actually, this is a line underneath the bed, this is also the ceiling fold, and then here you have the desk, and that's actually running into one point. So when you're actually bored and you're lying in your bed, you can actually sort of see the logic that is behind it. And then it's about kind of also about challenge. So we wanted to have a glass screen between bathroom and bedroom, but also kind of index a little bit the relationships between the different elements in the room. So this glass screen became actually deformed by those stainless steel furniture in here. You can see sort of in here how it's all a system that is elastically intertwined and related to each other, like this sink here and this long strip of furniture that starts as a shower, then becomes a bathtub, then becomes the back of the bed, and then finally a desk. So it's this kind of trying to weave everything together, and that connecting that with this kind of sheet of glass that you can see in here. And here you can actually see the different colors of rooms. This would be like the yellow section, and then you have here, this is another area of the green section, and how these furnitures that have all been designed by us. So this was a really nice opportunity, a really nice project to expand also the scale downwards from the architectural scale, the interior design, into the realm of the furniture, and to create this kind of total experience, let's say. So we could design this bathtub and so on. Very interesting for me was the sink, because like we designed it in such a way, when you come from here, you can almost not see its depth, so it looks like really like a sheet of paper. But from the other side, you see how it's actually cantilevering from this one foot, and how the triangulation makes that actually happen. But the triangulation is actually kind of hiding a little bit the kind of depth, so you can still run the pipes in there, and it's still kind of horizontal here, so you can put your soap in there. So it's actually kind of bringing together the necessities and the functions of a regular sink, but actually with an extremely different kind of articulation. And that actually I think that's a challenge that architecture can do. Art or other forms of artistic expression, they can be much more challenging. They can be doing a sink that doesn't work as a sink or so. But I think in architecture, that's sort of questionable, and we have to sort of serve the purpose, but then at the same time push certain other kind of expectations to the limits. Why do we want to do that? Because of the kind of normative behavior that we all have, right? So we go through the world every day and we have a certain routine, and we don't even think about it anymore. So we brush our teeth, and I think when you go to a hotel, you go to a nice design hotel, then that is an opportunity to step out of that routine, right? To actually wake up and relate yourself afresh to your surroundings. And not really this home from home concept that the Marriott hotels do or something like that, that they say, yeah, we want to not challenge people. We want to give them what they have already at home. I think the hotel should be actually giving this kind of sense of freedom and a little bit of a challenge. So this is what we kind of trying to do in this case. So in here, although you can actually use this thing very comfortably, you will still kind of like start to think, what is this? And then hopefully use it without problem. The only person that suffers is actually the cleaning lady, because the stainless steel things are so difficult to clean, and they really hate us in there. So that's something I didn't know. So next time we'll use something else. But what I enjoy most of this project is really the refractive nature of this kind of glass screen and these kind of metallic surfaces, where you can actually get an overlay of the lighting of the outside space, which is here in blue, which is sort of behind us, and then with the artificial light of that wall in the bathroom, and you get all these multiple reflections, and you just move a few steps to the side, and it's completely different. The photograph would be totally different, yeah. So the space is completely alive, yeah, and you can actually. It's not designed by us in a kind of like very fixed and certain scenario, but it's something of a different fields that actually blur into each other, and it's really animated that way. So then after Puerto America, we didn't get any kind of crazy Russian nightclubs or in something of that kind for some reason. So we started an office in the north of Italy, which is is the Alpine kind of like very mountainous region, because one of our employees went back and got some projects. So it's a completely extremely different context that you can see in here, yeah? So we did 2 projects in here, for instance. And one of them is this kind of 2 bars, and that was still an empty spot in here, so you can see there's a little bit of empty land, but mostly the town would spill over really and would kind of grow outwards. And in order to stop that, they're actually allowing kind of a densification and to kind of build up onto existing properties. So this is actually the site. Instead of building here, let's say we built actually on top of the existing building. So we took the existing roof off, and then we had to actually deal with that host, with that kind of existing building condition. And that's actually interesting because it was a split-level organization. This is half a level higher up. So we really had to tie our approach to that building. You can see that here in section. Yeah, so we put something new on top of it, but that new thing needed to be actually derived from the old one, which is very much our approach since then. Here you can sort of see how we started with a series of vertical sections that we strung along the whole length of the building, and that actually, although it's all kind of in some ways Cartesian, it enables really the kind of development of very subtle and very smooth kind of geometries and spatial articulations, as you can see in here, because we were quite keen in developing the roofscape, let's say, as an extension of the ground. Although this is really high up there, we wanted to replicate, let's say, the feeling of being able to walk around and to have this kind of 3-dimensional experience. So the system actually engages with the split-level condition by really having the staircases being mapped across the building and becoming actually the skin of the building, as you can see in here and in here. And yeah, the axis basically really becomes the modulation of the entire structure and the entire project. So, and here you can, see that in more detail. So you have these steps in here, and then these will grow up to the kind of like roof. And up here you can actually go above the roofscape, so you can have this 360 degrees panoramic view, yeah? So it's really challenging the kind of like normative conditions of like, okay, this is the floor, this is the wall, then that is the roof, and trying to weave them all together into one coherent experience. This is also about adventure. It's about seeing different things and expanding the kind of viewpoint for the residents, and also creating some sheltered conditions underneath these trellises, etc. Here, this is another project here. Then we got another project for a hotel very nearby from this one. It's all these projects are in the same area. As you can see, these amazing mountains, and this is the site. So we really wanted to face all the hotel rooms to that amazing view. And at the same time, dealing with the existing quite steep topography. So the convention of making topography lines and and cartographing landscape, we use that actually as a system to also describe the building and then actually to build the building. So we kind of related it to these kind of like wooden stacking systems that you find there in the area, and also the way, that horizontality and landscape can actually produce some incredibly exciting conditions. Meanwhile, the inside of a hotel, usually you want to have a lot of repetition. So these kind of units, they're quite complex in the way that they can be configured and reconfigured and be used by different kinds of groups. But also they want to be more like self-similar and actually quite regular and orthogonal. So that actually the skin becomes this kind of differential, the kind of relationship to the ground that relates or creates a kind of like freedom, or it peels off enough from that kind of Cartesian straitjacket in order to engage with the landscape. So it's these kind of two skins, or these kind of two systems that we are kind of negotiating or relating to each other. So here you can sort of see how we're developing also some double curvature from these very kind of like straight lines, and got kind of conditions that gives not that kind of system of actually employing these regular wooden sticks for a facade system that doesn't have to do any climatic kind of hard work. That's actually one smart move that we learned from Puerto America. Like in Puerto America, it was extremely difficult to deal with the doors, that they had to shut really like to a 5-star hotel standard and so on. And you really want to kind of separate the kind of complexity of a certain geometry from those areas or those functions that have to be high performance and low maintenance. So this was a kind of translation device between having a very kind of quite complex three-dimensional outside shape, let's say, and to implement that. So we actually laser cut these, and they came out of a script that was actually translating the overall geometry into this kind of into these flaps here. That each of these flaps had the local geometry of each situation, of each piece here being kind of can be different from the next one. And there had to be like an economy about this. So this is the only place where these two systems actually come together, and where they actually, where it's actually needed in order to transcribe and to build this. So here you see it finally. How the facade peels off, it kind of fuses with the landscape, so it's this kind of relationship between the building. The building in its discreteness is kind of undermined, or it's being expanded, and it flows. And then it creates all these interstitial spaces between these two systems. and these kind of sheltered outside conditions that are quite nice also for much time of the year. At the same time, this is again like unlike the kind of reflective surfaces, the open sticks are also very kind of like rich in terms of changing from daytime to nighttime and kind of producing different conditions throughout the year. And then the interior was actually been done according to what those users in those areas really want, sort of really cozy conditions and so on, but then at the same time clean cut and modern, and also bringing that kind of exterior condition into the kind of furniture to some extent as well. Yeah, this is a more recent project that we have completed down there, where again you have this very steep topography here. And this is the way we were thinking about it. So each of these, this is for an apartment building. So it's about the horizontality and the kind of repetition of these bands, let's say. Then at the same time, yeah, how these bands can then be extended into the landscape, into the ground, bring both systems together, and then create this vertical element, this canyon, to separate, because it's always 2 units per floor. So the project really derived from these different strategies altogether. And it was also an articulation of which areas of the facade are open to the weather and which are actually protected from it. So they were articulated differently with the copper in here on the outside. And then it's got these kind of wooden, much more domestic kind of surfaces that are sheltered. And they actually, these wooden surfaces, they expand, the interior, they're also found in the interior. So the interior and the exterior are kind of like more or less seamless in that way. And then you have that seam between interior and exterior more like where the weathering occurs. So, and then we're also developing quite sculptural elements here, sort of like canyons almost. This is from the other side, framing the mountain, and also the more traditional way where buildings. And yeah, here you see a little bit more the kind of like logic of these different levels. And from the back at the same time, it sort of ducks into the hillside. It becomes really part of the landscape much more than from the front. Yeah, here you can see kind of the relationship between inside and outside, how the exterior space is being carved out to respond to that. Yeah, particularly in here, right? How the edge of between inside and outside is kind of meandering and creates very specific kind of relationships. Just very quickly, like this is the typical projects that we're doing in China. It's like a twin tower. So we were given 2 sites to develop 2 twin tower projects. So this is still conceptually relatively interesting project, because what we were trying to do is create certain kind of like global relationships across these buildings. So normally the twin tower concept, when you look at it from far away, it means 2 buildings, right? And when you're close, then the podium is so big that it actually looks like 1 building. So we wanted to bring that kind of separation of the 2 towers, or the kind of land those 2 towers, into the experience of the ground floor level, and create a kind of permeability across it by introducing these kind of atrium levels and therefore communicating what's going on above and below. This is unfortunately never happened. Orders, I don't know, maybe some people of you have heard about it. It was a lot of projects that were projected for that city, and then the whole thing kind of tumbled. It became one of these ghost towns. We were supposed to design 5 office towers, and they were kind of they were given as like cubes basically. So that was being given for like a design code, and we started with the kind of landscape, in fact, and rather than thinking about the cubes first, we started about the site and how to create kind of like respond to the topography in a very specific way, and then offsetted these kind of cubes against this kind of topography lines and the kind of flow lines, and and that brought us to the idea of kind of introducing the fifth facade into the interior of the building. So we created these void spaces, these atrium voids that then became quite articulated as the extension of that articulated landscape. So you can sort of see that model was very informative for our approach, and the building really becomes like a tree. So it expands outwards, and in fact it has these trusses here, which maybe in the rendering were a little bit flimsy, but they're supposed to hold the facade and all the other floor slabs. So it's like expanding outwards and then raining down, let's say. I think this is actually showing it quite nicely. Yeah. So it's structurally a very interesting system, like this kind of tree organization, and that becomes translated into the way that the facade is structured. So up here you have a lot more elements. It's a lot denser because you have much more weight to carry, and down here the elements have to only carry one slab. Here 2, here 3. So it becomes lighter towards the bottom, and then that pattern, which is not self-similar but differentiated, can actually be articulated in terms of the translucency level, in terms of the insulation levels, and etc. So it can actually become, despite this kind of uniform appearance from far away, it can actually become quite localized, this building. So it's again this kind of breaking down the scales and in relation to the performance of the building. And this is this kind of core. And this is how we imagine this would look like and how it would relate to the landscape, really as this kind of like object, quite sublime kind of elements. And unfortunately, yeah, this didn't go ahead, but maybe we'll find another place for it one day. And this is, last project that I showed today, which is our biggest project to date, XI'AN EXPO. We did the International Horticultural Expo in XI'AN. Started in 2008, we won a competition. And this is actually the site that we were given. And this is, here you can see the outline of what was going to happen. But it's actually a kind of a completely industrial area that has been completely transformed into a picturesque, let's say, kind of articulation. But we wanted to offset that kind of big, large master plan that was trying to create some sort of Arcadia with something much more kind of performative, or like a machinic landscape, let's say. So here you can see these are the parking areas, and we had this idea of really mapping the flows of people, and there would always be only one bridge across this urban motorway. So and that bridge should lead to the kind of main exhibition hall. So this is a kind of an axis which was demanded by the competition brief. But in fact, at the same time, it's sort of like diluted by all these other options. And in itself, it's actually very diversified. So in that sense, we're breaking down the kind of like hierarchical way that China really kind of like is currently still kind of projecting such buildings and such landscapes and urban spaces, and we're creating something that has more to do with the landscape, with the choice as well. So at every intersection you have the choice to go to another place. So this system is inherently much more open, much more kind of fluid and differentiated. You can sort of see how that then becomes articulated in the smaller grain. And you can see how this landscape approach then becomes, actually is then articulated within the building quite seamlessly. So here you can see how the flows of people, they accumulate, they go across this bridge, and then this whole kind of like density will then spread out again. It will kind of loosen up, and most people will still stay in the center, and then the more people that are more interested in privacy, or they want to explore further afield, or they're really interested in horticultural exhibitions, etc., they can wander off, really. So there's a gradient between the center and towards the periphery, rather than having just one discrete kind of axis and then have something else on the side, let's say. So you get these kind of intersectional points within the system. Everything, because it had to be designed for, I don't know, 11 million people, everything is a bit overscaled. This is this bridge, and we thought of like, okay, why not building a trellis that then will be overgrown by green? So it kind of like signifies itself in a way as a green expo or like a horticultural fair. Unfortunately, those plants were never seeded, so it never happened that way. But at the same time, what is interesting about the bridge is this kind of braiding system that we used for the trellis is also been found in the organization of the floor plate of the bridge. And that was meant to actually alternate. So in the morning, you have actually 2 of those lanes for the incoming traffic and only 1 for the outside. And then in the evenings, it would kind of change over. And it's where these kind of different systems kind of collide. You really want to have quite an expedient solution, right? Because if you had to have some sort of somebody making up all these kind of angles here, these interlocking pieces between this kind of system, let's say this grid and this grid, then that would have been extremely expensive. So this was a very clever solution for the interstitial space, and quite nice at the same time. Particularly during rainy days, you can really see the difference in texture comes out a lot. And this is the trellis was designed as a tensegrity structure, but then unfortunately the code in China was not allowing for that. So in the end, it was a little bit of a strange hybrid. But still, the dynamism of that comes a little bit across here. And yeah, it would be really nice to see that with the green canopy. But yeah, they used a lot of different light colors and so on to animate this at night. And the third building that we designed is this, the greenhouse. So the greenhouse was built into the mountain, very much really kind of integrating it into the topography. And you can see that sort of thing and how it sits in there. And that also created this kind of gap access space. So we carved very kind of distinctively into the ground to create this kind of also backwards kind of the framing of looking back at the expo and also understanding really the kind of different levels and the articulation of the landscape in these moments. So this is actually the approach. When you come along this axis, this is sort of what you find. This is the main exhibition hall. It's very underwhelming, right? So that was extremely conceptual. I'm surprised we got away with this. We really turned the icon upside down. We really wanted to challenge this notion of, okay, this is the icon. This has to be iconic. This has to kind of scream, come here, visit me. But it's actually just, it looks just like, yeah, the landscape itself goes up a little bit. So it kind of camouflages towards where people come from. But then from in section, you can see how here it sort of like comes out of the landscape, and here it sort of becomes this big cantilever. So it's actually from the back in here that it becomes quite iconic. So it's really Palladio in reverse, yeah. So it's very contextual at the entrance, and then very much kind of standing out and being separate from the back. And it creates this quite nice interstitial spaces. These 3 fingers really, and the landscape flows through it, and then it articulates the relationship with the lake in that way. Internally, unfortunately, it was overwhelmed with exhibition, but we had this interesting kind of looping system here going through it, so that these cantilevered arms became this kind of connection between two levels, and there was different ways of flowing through the exhibition. But then that wasn't really good enough, so it had to be like much more distinctive, so they actually cut off half of it and so on, which was very unfortunate. But yeah, you see in here, it's very simple actually diagram, yeah? So these are actually arms of landscape that go underneath here. You have this bar going across it, and then you get these kind of loops stitching the two levels. This is on 2 levels, stitching it all together, overlooking these double height spaces, yeah? So yeah, this is very important, I think, for us, how the landscape, how this kind of axis, these different arms of the landscape kind of like go underneath the flow throughout the building underneath it, and create this kind of undercrofts. That then became actually the most popular area of the whole expo, because it was super hot and there was no shade. Nobody thought about shade. Maybe we should have thought about it. But in this case, we succeeded. This was very kind of pleasant area with the water and so on to hang out and lots of people did that actually. Here you can see how also the reflective ceiling was quite an interesting extension to that space, yeah, and how crowded it really became actually. So, and this was before it was actually opening. There you just had some of the security people walking through it and not much else. But the kind of like speciality of this undercrofts was something that we really enjoyed, and how this actually when you came from the access, it was really framing this strange pagoda, this kind of modern interpretation of a Chinese classic. So yeah, in that sense, it's really about this kind of dialogue, right? About the kind of how the present or maybe something about the future even, if and something that is really the present, but it's really a look at the past, yeah, can actually kind of like are quite distinct kind of approaches these days, and interwoven in this kind of architectural moment, yeah, and I think that's pretty much from today, how the different scales, the different time kind of references, let's say, can create a kind of like expansiveness in the mind of the individual kind of user. Looking forward to some questions and answers. Thank you very much.